They told Karoline Leavitt to leave, expecting her to get angry. Her response left the whole diner in silence. Karoline Leavitt pulled into the parking lot of Owen's Diner, a modest spot in the middle of Springfield, Ohio. It was the kind of place that had been around for decades, its neon sign flickering slightly, the scent of grilled burgers and fresh coffee slipping through the crack of the door every time someone walked in or out. She had heard about it from a local earlier that day, someone who swore by their homemade meatloaf and hand-cut fries. She was exhausted. A long day of meetings, handshakes, and policy discussions had worn her down, and all she wanted was a quiet meal before the drive back. The bell above the door jingled as she stepped inside. The place was small but welcoming, at least, that's how it felt at first. The kind of diner where the same handful of regulars occupied the same booths every night, where a wall of faded Polaroids by the register showcased decades of customers and staff. The air was thick with the scent of bacon grease and brewed coffee, and the low hum of conversation filled the room. Karoline caught the eye of the hostess behind the counter. She was mid-smile until she recognized her. It was quick, barely a second, but Karoline noticed it. A hesitation. The kind that flickered across a person's face when they suddenly weren't sure what to do. Her lips pressed together in a thin line. Karoline glanced around. A few customers had turned their heads in her direction. One man, halfway through his burger, leaned in and whispered something to the person across from him. Another, a woman in a flannel shirt, set down her coffee cup a little too hard, eyes narrowing just slightly before looking away. Karoline wasn't naive. She'd been in enough rooms to sense when she wasn't entirely welcome. But a diner? The hostess hesitated, then stepped forward, tucking a loose strand of hair behind her ear. Good evening, she said, her voice careful. Are you dining in or taking out? Karoline let out a small, tired chuckle. Dining in, if that's all right. Another pause. Too long for a simple question, actually. Irregular people, but you play politics like everyone else. Karoline nodded slowly, considering that. All right, she said. Then tell me, what do you think I should have done differently? The guy blinked. That wasn't the response he was expecting. You want me gone, Karoline continued, her tone even. Fine. But you've got the floor. Say what you need to say. The diner was dead silent now. Even the kitchen had gone still. No plates clinking, no orders being called out. Don sighed, rubbing the back of his neck. This ain't what I expected tonight. She glanced over her shoulder toward the kitchen, then back at her. I need to check something real quick, she said. Just one moment. She disappeared through the swinging door, and Karoline was left standing there. A few more heads turned her way. A man at the counter shifted in his seat. Someone muttered something under their breath. Something wasn't right. The seconds stretched on. From behind the kitchen doors, muffled voices rose and fell, too indistinct to make out. Karoline exhaled slowly, rolling her shoulders back. She wasn't going to make a scene. She wasn't going to assume anything either. Maybe there was a policy. Maybe they were short-staffed. The hostess returned. This time, she didn't look uncertain. She looked decided. I'm sorry, ma'am, she said, her voice firmer now. We can't serve you tonight. But the way she said it, the way the whole room seemed to tighten around her words, made it clear this wasn't about business. This was personal. For a brief moment, Karoline said nothing. The words just sat there between them, thick and heavy, like the kind of statement that didn't need an explanation. The diner had gone quiet, not silent, but quiet enough. The sizzle of the grill in the back still crackled. A fork scraped against a plate somewhere. But the usual hum of conversation had dulled. People were watching, waiting. Karoline studied the hostess's face. She wasn't hostile, just firm. Like she'd made up her mind. Or maybe someone else had made it up for her. Her eyes flicked past the hostess toward the kitchen window. A pair of cooks stood just beyond the counter, half hidden behind a heat lamp stacked with plates. Their expressions were unreadable. She cleared her throat. I'm sorry, did I do something wrong? The hostess didn't fidget this time. It's just, we'd rather not serve you tonight. No policy. No, we're closing soon. Just that. Karoline let her hands settle on her hips. exhaling through her nose. She'd been in her fair share of uncomfortable situations, from political debates to interviews designed to trip her up. But there was something different about being turned away from a place as simple as a roadside diner. A cough broke the moment. Karoline turned slightly, catching the gaze of an older man sitting near the counter. The guy looked like he'd been coming here for years. His blue work jacket frayed at the cuffs. His hands weathered from a lifetime of labor. He shook his head, more to himself than anyone else, before stabbing at the last of his eggs. A few booths over, a woman shifted in her seat, her expression unreadable. Across from her, a younger man, probably in his 30s, leaned back with his arms crossed, like he was enjoying the show. Karoline took it all in. The eyes that looked away the second they met hers. The ones that lingered too long. The ones that held something sharper, something closer to satisfaction. She could feel the weight of the moment pressing on her. She had options. She could walk out, shake her head, let it go. She could demand an explanation, call them out, ask if they had any idea what this would look like in the morning news cycle. She could challenge them outright, see if they'd stick to their decision, when they realized they were refusing a public figure. Instead, she did none of those things. "All right," she said, nodding slowly. Her voice was even, measured. "Can I speak with the manager?" That caught a few people off guard. The hostess hesitated again, glancing toward the kitchen, as if asking for silent permission. The older man at the counter muttered something under his breath. Someone near the window let out a short laugh, like they couldn't believe she was actually going through with this. Karoline just stood there, waiting. The hostess disappeared again, this time through a different door. A few more beats of silence. A sip of coffee. A plate being slid across the counter. Then the door swung open, and a man in his early 50s stepped out, broad-shouldered, thick arms crossed over a grease-stained apron. His name tag read Don. Don didn't ask Karoline what she wanted. He just looked her over once, then said, "I hear you got a question." But the way he said it wasn't welcoming. It wasn't even polite. It was a challenge. Karoline met Don's stare, steady and unreadable. She wasn't here to argue. She wasn't here to throw her weight around. But she also wasn't about to just walk out without understanding why. "Yeah," Karoline said. "I'd like to know why you won't serve me." Don exhaled sharply through his nose, like he'd been expecting the question but still wasn't in the mood to answer. He wiped his hands on his apron, glancing toward the handful of customers still watching the exchange. Some pretended not to listen. Others didn't bother hiding their curiosity. "Look," Don said, shifting his weight. "This ain't personal." Karoline raised an eyebrow. "Seems pretty personal." Don's jaw tightened. He rubbed the back of his neck, then finally sighed. "People around here got their opinions about you, about the things you stand for. I got a business to run, and I don't want trouble." Karoline nodded slowly, letting the words sink in. "And me sitting down for a meal is trouble?" Don didn't answer right away. He glanced toward the counter, where the old man in the work jacket had gone back to his eggs, chewing a little slower now. A few booths away, the younger guy still had his arms crossed, watching, like this was the best entertainment he'd had all week. Karoline had seen this before, not exactly like this, but close enough. It wasn't about a single decision. It was about what it meant, how it would look, how people would react. It was about the ripple effect, the pressure from all sides, the silent expectations that could push a person into making choices they weren't sure about. She glanced back at Don. "Be honest with me. Do you agree with this? Or is this just about keeping the peace?" Don hesitated. His fingers curled slightly against his apron. And for the first time, Karoline saw something that almost looked like discomfort. Like maybe Don wasn't as sure about this as he wanted to seem. But before the man could answer, the younger guy in the booth let out a sharp laugh. "Oh, come on," he said, shaking his head. "This ain't that deep. You're just not welcome here, simple as that." Karoline turned toward him, studying him for a moment. He looked like the kind of guy who enjoyed a good fight. Someone who had been waiting for an excuse to say something. Karoline didn't bite. She just looked back at Don. I've got no problem leaving if that's really what you want. The words hung there, giving Dawn a chance. A chance to take a breath, to reconsider, to push back against whatever pressure had led to this moment. Dawn's gaze flicked toward the kitchen, then back to Karoline. I just don't want things to get ugly, Dawn said finally. Karoline nodded. Neither do I. For a long moment, neither of them spoke. Karoline could have left. She could have shaken her head, walked out, and never looked back. She could have made a call, turned this into a headline, let the internet do what it does best. But instead, she did something no one expected. She pulled out a chair, sat down, and said, "Then let's talk." The room tensed. Karoline didn't slam the chair down. She didn't puff up her chest or raise her voice. She simply sat, resting her hands on the table, like she had all the time in the world. The diner wasn't used to this. Confrontations usually ended quickly, with one side storming out or shutting down. But this wasn't that. Dawn looked at her for a long moment, then let out a slow exhale. Talk, he repeated, as if the word itself didn't belong here. Karoline shrugged. You don't want me here, I get that. What I don't get is why. So let's talk about it. A low chuckle came from the younger guy in the booth. Man, this lady's got nerve. Karoline ignored him. Dawn pulled out the chair across from Karoline but didn't sit down. Instead, he leaned on it, arms resting against the back. His apron was still dusted with flour, the kind that had probably been there since the morning shift. I run a business, Dawn said finally. I don't pick fights. I don't want headlines. But I got a community to think about. Karoline nodded. All right. So tell me, what does this community think about me? Dawn looked over his shoulder, almost like he was waiting for someone else to answer that question. The waitress by the counter shifted uncomfortably. The man in the work jacket kept his eyes down, but his fork hadn't moved in a while. Then Dawn looked back. People here don't like politicians. Don't trust them. And some of the things you've said, some of the things you've stood for. It doesn't sit right with folks. Karoline leaned back slightly. Fair enough. But you don't know me, do you? Dawn hesitated. Not personally, no. Then tell me, Karoline continued, if I was just some person walking in here, not someone you've seen on TV, would we even be having this conversation? Silence. Karoline let the quiet stretch, watching Dawn's expression shift just slightly. Not a full change, but something had cracked, even if it was small. But then, from the back of the room, the younger guy scoffed. This isn't about TV, lady. It's about people knowing who you really are. Karoline turned toward him. And who am I? The guy grinned, finally getting the attention he'd been craving. Karoline cracked a small, tired smile. Me neither. But for the first time, the tension wasn't just about division. It was about something else, something closer to understanding. The diner wasn't just quiet now, it was watching. Even those who had pretended not to care were listening, sneaking glances over their plates. Karoline sat there, patient. The younger guy, still leaning back in his booth, looked like he wanted to say something, but for the first time, hesitation crossed his face. Maybe because he realized Karoline wasn't arguing, she wasn't defending herself, she was just waiting. Dawn, still gripping the chair in front of him, finally let out a breath. You want to know what people think? He shook his head. They think you're full of it. Karoline didn't react, just tilted her head slightly, like she was considering the words. They think you talk about working-class folks, but you still play the game. That you make promises like every other politician in a suit, but when it comes down to it, nothing changes. Dawn exhaled through his nose. And they don't forget. Karoline nodded slowly. I get that. The younger guy let out a scoff. That's all you're gonna say? Karoline turned toward him. What else do you want me to say? The guy straightened in his seat. I don't know, man. You're supposed to argue, defend yourself, say something. Karoline rested her forearms on the table. You already made up your mind about me before I walked through that door. You wanted me to get mad, wanted me to fight back so you could feel justified. The guy's mouth opened slightly, but nothing came out. Karoline continued, her voice steady. But what if I told you I know exactly what that frustration feels like? She looked back at Dawn. You said nothing changes. I know that feeling. I grew up in it. I watched people around me get left behind. How I felt left behind. And yeah, I went to school, did things people never expected me to do, but that doesn't mean I forgot. Don's fingers tapped against the chair, his expression unreadable. But he didn't look dismissive, he looked thoughtful. Karoline glanced around the diner. You don't have to agree with me. I'm not here to change your minds. But I walked in here as a customer, not a politician, just a woman looking for a meal. The pause. Then from the counter, the old man in the work jacket muttered, Damn shame when a woman can't even get a burger. The tension cracked, just slightly. A few people smirked. Even Don let out a small chuckle, shaking his head. Karoline turned back to him. So, what now? Don exhaled, running a hand over his face. He looked toward the kitchen, where the cooks were still watching, then back at Karoline. I'll tell you what, Don finally said. You sit here and finish this conversation, and if by the end of it I don't think you're just another person talking a good game, maybe, just maybe, I'll have my waitress bring you a menu. Karoline nodded, a small smirk tugging at the corner of her mouth. Sounds like a deal. For the first time that night, the room didn't feel divided. It felt like something else, something closer to a conversation. The air in the diner had changed. The stiffness in Don's shoulders had eased, just a little. The younger guy in the booth had lost his smirk, now sitting up instead of leaning back like this was some kind of show. Even the customers who had stayed quiet, who had just been watching from the sidelines, seemed less certain of their own judgments. Karoline leaned forward slightly. All right, she said, her voice calm. Let's finish this conversation. Don exhaled, dropping into the chair across from her. He looked tired, not the kind of tired that comes from a long shift, but the kind that settles deep in a person. The weight of years of expectations, of feeling like the world isn't listening. I'll be honest, Don said, rubbing his hands together. I don't know if you're. They still had their doubts, but for one night in one small town, a different kind of conversation had happened. And maybe that was enough. Because in a time when everyone is ready to shout, sometimes the real power is in staying, listening, and proving, if only for a moment, that not everything has to be a fight. If you made it this far, I've got one question for you. Have you ever been in a situation where you had to choose between walking away and staying to listen? Drop your thoughts in the comments. I'd love to hear what you think. And if you found this story worth your time, don't forget to like, subscribe, and hit that notification bell. There's always another story to tell, and I'll be here to share it with you. Until next time.